Cool. Chris tells me we are live. So good evening, everybody. Good evening, at least to the Eastern-based ones on the call, like all of our panelists. So welcome to our webinar tonight. The objective of it is understanding the new norm in customer behavior. This is for taking an angle of it, which is from a few countries that have exited lockdowns, or at least are in their first exit, like some of our participants from Hong Kong. Countries that are still in full lockdown, like some of our participants from KL or Manila, or countries that are somewhere there in between, as Jerome was just telling us, for Singapore. So introducing myself first, I'm Giulio. I've been with Zalora for the past 7.5 years now, so since the company was very young and very small. And I currently lead the commercial operations in Zalora, so I hold the title of Chief Commercial Officer. With us, we have from actually 5 different countries, 3 representatives of our supply side, of our supply operations and of the fashion world, and 2 representatives of the online and the demand side of things, at least for tonight, from the tech world. So we have Stuart from the Coronon Group, where he is both a co-founder and the general manager, joining us from Melbourne in Australia. We have Jonathan from the PVH Group, where he is senior vice president and leads particularly their strategy side and their unified commerce side, which I guess stands also for e-commerce, amongst others. We have Shasha. Shasha is part of the Zalora team. She's based in KL, and she leads our modest wear supply, so the Muslim side of our consumers. That is not indifferent, given we are based in both Malaysia and Indonesia. And then we have Jerome. Jerome leads the e-commerce industry sector in Google Southeast Asia, based in Singapore. And Marty from the Facebook team, based in Manila, probably experiencing one of the strictest lockdowns, at least amongst the panelists in the call. Jumping from there, so the objective, as I said earlier, is understanding a bit how the lockdowns, the pandemic, and the overall shifts in customer behavior have affected our businesses, and particularly try and put out there some opinions and data on how it might affect our businesses' demand, and particularly demand for fashion in the future and months to come. There's a lot of doom and gloom out there. If I were to take the McKinsey report for fashion this year, very different from the last couple of years. It talks about a drop in business of 1/4 to 1/3, so 25% plus for across the fashion world. If I were to take their objective instead point of view on number of businesses, they're actually talking about 1/3 of fashion companies and brands going out of businesses or having to go through a consolidation in this period. This said, I think particularly amongst the participants in this call, there is possibly a better point of view, and we can possibly throw a bit of optimism on the table. There are a lot of brands that are actually growing and are growing through e-commerce, and e-commerce is very talked about, whether it's new solutions brought to the table or enhancing the existing solutions for brands, as well as brands and subcategories that per se are benefiting or growing or increasing their share throughout the lockdowns and across different geographies and countries, and depending on the impacts there are. Moving on from there, the objective here today is to understand a bit what are those impacts, what do we expect to last, and how do we expect it to change the way we take decisions, particularly for brand owners and retailers listening to us. I'll kick off by trying to throw out there a couple of conversation starters, and it's really just a couple of screen grabs from an internal tool that we have, an internal tool called Trender. It's our own in-house analytics tool for Zalora, which we make available to all of our brand partners. And trying to throw out there essentially what we've been seeing in the past couple of months. So I hope you all see my screen and see what I'm projecting. But essentially, what we've done with the team is we've taken for each country that we operate in, these are the 6 Zalora countries in Southeast Asia, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. We've split time periods in a couple of months pre-COVID, the, let's say, low alert period, so periods in which countries were on alert, but not on the full stringent lockdown, so still with the offline sector open, in other words. And then into the period where the offline sector was actually closed down. For certain countries, naturally, these periods have different extents of time. As Marty said earlier, for the Philippines, probably the last bar, the high alert period, is the longest. Whilst for Hong Kong, the low alert period might be the longest. This said, we then averaged that data out and tried to provide an idea of how our consumers have changed their behaviors throughout this period. So the first snippet is our apparel category and how the share of sales across subcategories has changed. And whilst I think it's very evident, I'm sure probably Stuart will be able to share about it later too, but our dresses category has suffered and is still suffering from the lockdowns and from the new habits in consumer behavior. But at the same time, that has seen a shift in tops. And tops have maintained, aside an initial bleep in March and the first couple of weeks of April, has actually gone back to our previous trends and what we saw last year in terms of rebase to 100 trend. If I move on to a deep dive into the category, essentially, who's buying apparel? Who's buying apparel has changed. What we see is an increase in new customers, and of course it is a e-commerce point of view, an increase in new customers, and particularly a pronounced increase in new customers in the age bands between 20 and 30 years old. So we've seen particularly our 21 to 25 increase by more than 33% in terms of share of sales. You can see that red bar going from 12% to 16%. Something instead that is a encounter tendency, and maybe Google and Facebook can later tell us also about if they're seeing something similar, but is device. People are back to shopping from desktop. Now, again, it's a small share. We're talking about 12 to 14%. So we're not going against the fact that e-commerce is now mobile-based first, but it is the first time in 8 years that we ever see consistently an increase in desktop usage, or better, a non-decrease in share of desktop usage. As I slide down, let's take another point of view. So the sports category, and Jonathan plays in both sides. He has a bit of sports in his athleisure lines. So does Stuart with some of his cotton on lines. Now, we actually see that sports overall being less impacted from a Zalora stance. We see our shoes, both performance and lifestyle, taking a hit in the sense that they're staying in line with the rebased 100 trend of last year. And they did bleep, as we can see, that blue line going below that gray line at some point in March and early April, but they recovered faster than any other category. And instead, what we see very clearly is the rise of athleisure and generally sports apparel. We see a very pronounced peak in tops, with the share increasing by more than 50%. And in less so, but in terms of overall absolute share, but still a pronounced rise of more than 60% in share for bottoms. If I deep dive into those sports customers, we see something similar to what we've seen in apparel, but significantly more pronounced for younger age groups. So we see the below 21 and the 21 to 25s, which are really grabbing and entering as e-commerce customers into this space. So sports for e-commerce is bigger in absolute size, and the share coming to our below 25s seems to be bigger yet. Gender, there's a slight shift. Now, this might be a bleep in the data, but we seem to see a slight increase in male usage. This is, be clear though, also very Zalora specific. Zalora is a female first platform, and as such has a higher share of female on sports usage. This might be very different from what sport retailers are seeing on their own brand.coms, which I would imagine were more male driven. With that, I hope to have provided just a few points out there for our panelists and maybe for you to ask us questions in the last 10 minutes of this call. We're going to open up in the last 10 minutes for questions from the audience, which I'm going to bring to our different panelists. In the meanwhile, I will start by trying to initiate a bit of conversation between the panelists whom I've invited before the call to interrupt each other without shame and ask each other questions without shame. So I hope to have an interactive session, but I guess that's also up to me to generate. So Jerome, maybe I'll kick off with you and I'll kick off with the demand side of things. You know, you guys, of course, have a bird's eye view on this, both you and Marty, and you kind of get to see trends, well, year round. COVID doesn't make a difference, but you get to see trends ahead and you get to see how shifts are moving in one direction or the other. Everybody's talking about a strong shift to online shopping. And, you know, how can you reflect that in your data? Do you see similar pointers in terms of a category stance? But mostly, can you give some of our listeners some pointers from a country specific stance? Because most of our listeners would also have an objective of how do I keep my offline side going and where do I focus with my e-commerce side? And yeah, might want to get from you a bit of insights on a country specific level.
Absolutely. Thanks, Drew. I think it's been a very, very interesting time for us if we kind of zoom out and look at the holistic perspective, because there's just so much happening. There's been so many changes and shifts in so many different categories. So if we look at it from a bird's eye view, as you mentioned, I think it has been a really fascinating time just trying to work out, you know, where really are the trends sitting? You know, what is spiking, what is sustaining, and what is going to happen in the next, you know, in the next few months. So I think we've seen a number of shifts, and I think those are largely related, firstly, to lockdowns and how they came in. You know, as we started getting announcements like Boston Orange in Singapore is just one of the many examples, we started seeing, you know, huge shifts in category consumption, like groceries, a lot of necessities. So that quickly evolved. We started seeing more sustained trends popping up in beauty, home, workout, and a lot of this has been, it shouldn't be too surprising for you. And I think we did see, you know, this sort of evolution of categories over time. So we've been looking really closely into that, and we started realizing that there was this close relationship between government announcements and that causing a huge surge in certain types of consumer behavior. We've also noticed a really strong demand for marketplaces across the board. So search interest has been very, very healthy, I think, as offline options for retail had closed down. I think very similar to your data, you know, we had seen a lot of new users. We've been running a number of Google consumer surveys over the past few months to sort of analyze consumer sentiment and you know, cross-check that with some of our search data. And we've found, you know, our indicator results are that we've got over 25% of online shoppers are new, coming from those surveys. And a lot of these consumers, the vast majority of them indicate that they're planning to continue to purchase post lockdown. So we've seen this huge acceleration and transformation of the e-commerce industry, which we do think is going to be relatively sticky. On the YouTube side, we've also seen a lot of video consumption surging, you know, cooking, self-improvement, DIY, a lot of even meditation and sort of self-help. A lot of these categories have really skyrocketed in quite a sustained way. And that's led to some really interesting implications for marketers and how they want to design product or how they want to think about how they can market their products. I think now we're at a stage where we've seen a lot of these shifts happen throughout lockdowns, and we're going into this post-lockdown stage, which is getting really interesting. We've been analyzing a lot of markets like Vietnam that had opened up a little bit earlier, Germany, New Zealand, markets that have done very well at sort of sustaining the virus and had gone into sort of an earlier lockdown easing period. We're seeing sort of three types of rebounds happening more broadly. Shocks, so we'll get a couple of shocks or spikes in demand in some categories that quickly normalize. Step changes, so a couple of things like online groceries, for example, that we know have kind of sustained and have gone through a shock, but that shock has sort of really has normalized a bit, but is still very, very healthy. And sort of a more gradual acceleration and sustained change. And if we look into what's really step changing, I think it's a really interesting conversation to have for fashion. Our Google consumer surveys were indicating that there's a lot of pent-up demand at the moment for key categories like fashion. So we're wondering whether there will be large spikes. We looked at China, and there were quite a few big spikes and a gradual sort of rebound in women's apparel, which was quite interesting. So there could be some relatively large spikes ahead, but that will quickly normalize, but we'll sort of be on a gradual trend or a gradual rebound. In New Zealand and Germany, we saw staple fashion kind of really drop initially, but then has rebounded significantly and sort of exceeded this pre-COVID baseline in terms of interest, which I thought was quite interesting. People also, searching a lot for activities they missed, so eating out, shopping, travel. So I think there's going to be a lot of potential spikes in these areas as we ease out of lockdown as well. So I think those are just a couple of ideas just that I could sort of share from my side. If I were to go into sort of country specifics, those are the ones that we've been analyzing most closely, just in the post-lockdown period. But if we look at sort of Southeast Asia, it really does differ. Singapore is such a different market to Indonesia and Malaysia. But generally, we are seeing, and we do think that if we look at the fashion category broadly, we do think we are going to see some of these spikes ahead, and we should see, I think, as some of your data is indicating as well, some healthy rebounds as we ease out of lockdown.
Thank you, Jerome. That's very insightful. I think to take out a couple of pointers from that, most markets you've seen like us bleeps during the March, April period, but then actually you see the averages going back to even better than pre-lockdown levels. And what I also picked up was the storyline is probably changing in terms of consumer behavior, but probably it's an acceleration of an existing storyline, which is pointing towards personal development, wellness, more than, it's a more added consumption, a more personal improvement consumption kind of level. Well, maybe switching the conversation from that to from the multi-country to the multi-brand approach. So, Stuart, you guys and the Coronon Group as a whole, you manage a array of brands that span across from the shoes segment all the way to the underwear and loungewear segment with your Coronon body lines. In addition to that, most of these brands play into the lower end but accessible and value for money price points. Do you think that multi-brand approach and that price point strategy or positioning has been a factor of resilience and help during this period? And do you think that it might in some way help you also in coming out from it? And how are you looking at this as your staple over the coming months and seasons? You're going to keep the whole array, expand it, invest more or less in some brands. If you can give us some insights, even at brand level, to whichever extent you can, it'd be welcome.
No problem. Certainly we've found having a multi-brand, having all 7 brands on our mega site has certainly given us a lot of insight. We've learnt things as an omni-channel brand that we were probably thinking we'd experience in 2023 or 24. So the casual nature of our whole business has obviously, from the data you've shown, there's the huge wins we've had with Cotton On Body across our own sites and across the Zalora business. another GFG sites as well. So the active part of that, but just as importantly, there was certainly an initial spike with that, but then the lounge component of that business has been really strong. Our overall brands are quite casual. It's an Australian lifestyle brand, so we tend to, if anything was going to happen, people wanted to be comfortable and casual at home. It's sort of a perfect situation for a brand like Cotton On and the group. So as a cut and sew and fleece-based business, tracksuit pants, fleece, all those things sitting around, being comfortable at home, working from home, we've certainly had, a huge spike in that part of our business. I know we talked about dresses. We initially obviously deal in casual, not the ready-to-wear dress range, but early days were our knit dresses and casual dresses, certainly in summer, were still a comfortable wear and easy wear. So we have sold knit dresses really well, and actually the woven dresses have come back at our price point quite strong. So as a business, a 25-year-old business, we were started in a recession. So as a value brand, I think our DNA for us to work in difficult environments, we're always looking for opportunities in difficult times to make sure that we can deliver value and fashion to the customer. Just because this has happened, the customers, still looking for something to do, still looking for something fresh fashion-wise, and our price point makes that accessible. So the big wins for us were certainly the active brand. What took a couple of weeks and then has really spiked and actually sort of grown all the way through that is our kids business. Again, it's a casual-based business, but the huge win for the kids business was average dollar too. We're finding that those purchases, whether through baby and through kids, as kids are growing and they need new size and grow out of their clothes, there seemed to be a much larger uptake in average basket of purchases when that customer was coming online. So the business in most of the regions has sort of been operating at our version of cyber levels for going on 7 weeks now. So as we've opened up our regions, so for the people listening, as we've started to open up some regions in the Southern Hemisphere and some through Southeast Asia, we've found that it's certainly dropped a little bit, our online business, but there's certainly a new watermark that's been achieved now as an omni-channel brand. So customers that had shopped with us through bricks and mortar were forced to shop online and found that experience something they like. So we've certainly come back a little bit, but just way up from where we would be from a comp perspective as far as online business, which has been great. And for everyone, our South African business, New Zealand business, Australian business over the last 3 weeks has come back from a bricks and mortar perspective, and having really strong business there. So there's a spike initially, but it seems to be pretty consistent that the appetite for the customer for the things they were looking pre-COVID are very similar. So it's not just a shutdown and nothing's happening. There's certainly a really strong appetite for the customer to come back and have that social experience in store. Now it's our business is how do we make that whole omni-channel experience continue through.
Thank you, Stuart. It's great. I think the last part of your answer was probably the one that brought the most optimism to everybody. Knowing that South Africa, Australia, New Zealand have come back 100% for the stores is great news. Great news for everyone. I was actually getting some pretty negative information from one of the governments here in Southeast Asia that was telling me that with an initial reopening, they were only seeing 10 to 15% of volumes coming back in the stores. But knowing that is probably just the first 1 or 2 weeks, and then that develops into something going back to previous levels is great. The insight on kids is also very good. I would have imagined with the not sending them out for school anymore, demand might have actually dropped. While I actually would say, even if I don't have it on our slides for today, we've been seeing a very similar trend. So our kids' business, a bit small and still at the beginning of its life, is growing faster than sports, if anything, on a percentage level. Well, jumping from there, so let's go towards the.
Can I just?
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, Julia. I'll just jump in on the kids side as well. I mean, I just corroborate that as well from the Google side. I think we have sort of seen kids category more broadly go through a really strong growth, and that has continued, post-COVID in a number of markets. So it's been an interesting insight that we've picked up.
That's great to know.
Yeah.
Jumping from there into, maybe let's take let's go even towards the north, because we've heard a bit about the strong government reactions and reopenings in New Zealand and South Africa and even Vietnam to some extent from Stuart. But Jonathan, you had let's say the burden of having to look at this from an APAC perspective. So you had to look at what was happening to your PVH China stores a lot earlier than all of us. But then probably also the foresight to know what could happen later in the rest of the Southeast Asia business. And now you have, again, a bird's eye view of how the reopening is going from a pure offline perspective in Hong Kong and in mainland China. What are your expectations based on what you're seeing there of what might happen in our Southeast Asian markets and the rest of our?
Sure. So, I mean, I think if you look at it, I think we've had as close to this V-shaped recovery that some folks have been speaking about in mainland China in terms of, traffic and demand and things. When you look at the total market and when you look at the apparel category in particular. So when you look at aggregate mall traffic, when you look at, the numbers that various folks have put out, it really seems like across consumer discretionary categories, we're definitely not yet at that 2019 level in terms of where we ended 19 in terms of the industry. But I think pretty much people are feeling more optimistic from that point of view. I think when you really break it down a little bit more into the malls and you look at, are people in grocery stores? Are they in coffee shops? Are they in specialty apparel retailers? You start to see maybe some different trends, but I think also part of that is to the points that were made earlier. People are rotating more into e-commerce. It's an acceleration of things that were already happening. I think in Southeast Asia, I think the timing is just a bit different, right? So I think each market has been impacted differently. Governments have taken different options and choices based on how they've seen things play out locally. And so I think you see a little bit of a difference there just in terms of the timing piece. But then looking forward, I think one of the interesting things you saw a lot in China was really leveraging of things like WeChat and whatnot to drive either new commercial opportunities or to find new solutions to connecting supply and demand, even if stores are closed, even if logistics networks are impacted. So I think that's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out in some of the Southeast Asian markets, especially depending on when they really feel like they're in a good position to start, as we're going to see in a couple of weeks, some more reopenings and things coming back. So I think that's going to be probably a longer period of recovery, just given that in some markets, obviously, there's a lot more of a tourism driving demand. So if you pick up a market like Hong Kong or a market like Singapore, for example, you definitely have a historical level of tourism demand in brick and mortar stores. So if there's travel bans, quarantine restrictions, things like that, I think there will be some impact to retailers. But I think that rotation into e-commerce is definitely going to stay at a certain level, whether it stays at the level it is now or maybe, stabilizes a bit and then continues to grow. I think that's anybody's guess. But I do think we're going to see a little bit of a different play out in each of the markets in Southeast Asia, just given some of the differences market by market.
Thanks, Jonathan. Thank you. Maybe now I want to switch again radically and go from the Hong Kong China point of view to Shasha and let one of the Zalorians speak. So aside from myself, but Shasha, the lockdowns, at least in Southeast Asia, And a bit like in China, they coincided a lot with the Chinese New Year period and hit a really profitable period for travel operators as much as retailers. In Southeast Asia and in Malaysia and Indonesia in particular, they're hitting pretty much an equivalent period during the month of late April and May. And that is your Lebaran for the Indonesians and instead Hari Raya for the Malaysians. And this impacts a huge portion of your business, which is the modest wear, occasion wear business. So, could you, give us a bit of insights from a Muslim consumer standpoint and how their stance and how their habits would have been impacted by the lockdowns, and potentially then circumvent back into that occasion wear, and also looking at some of the questions from our audience, some of the occasion wear brands in the West that, even if not modest wear focused, ultimately focus again on occasion, and want to understand how you're keeping your business at a high, because you are during this time period.
Okay, thank you, Julius. So Ramadan, which is where we're at right now, is indeed a month where, as Muslims, we wait for it, we look forward to it, because it's actually the month of the holy month, where not only do we practice fasting in the daytime, but also a time where we make good deeds. So at the end of Ramadan, which is on Sunday actually, is where we celebrate Eid, and also known as Hari Raya in Malaysia and Singapore, also known as Lebaran in Indonesia. So it's a month of celebration. So pre-COVID situation, this is when we visit family and elders, we travel back to our hometowns. It is also a month where there's all these open houses where we invite family and friends to your home for a feast, and we build stronger unity amongst each other. So in other words, this is a time where everyone wants to display their fancy Raya or Lebaran wear. However, with the lockdown that affected Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, we did see a substantial decline in sales performance in the beginning. So logically, people were prioritizing essential items, basic needs for themselves and their homes. However, we noticed that the sales started picking up again once everyone got adjusted to the new norm. So consumption was slowly regaining its momentum, but only in styles that fit their needs at that point of time. So we saw improvement in sales on things like loungewear, because they're mostly at home, and prayer wear, because, I guess that's a good time to start praying more. And next, with everyone working from home, we noticed that customers were looking for styles that were semi-formal and comfortable pieces to wear, and look presentable during their Zoom calls. So this is also, we saw a spike in sales from our basic range, which is our Zalia Basic, as well as the workwear tops from our brand Zalia. But once the control movement order was announced in Malaysia, which is on 4th of May, and the Malaysian government announced that we are allowed to do somewhat some Raya visiting, when we can visit some people, but limited number of people in a place, then people started realizing that Raya is still going to happen, and they need something to wear, at least for the sake of their family portraits and selfies, and in this age of social media domination, consumption was back on track. We were already seeing many TikTok videos and all clads in their Raya outfits and Lebaran outfits. So I think, during this whole time, we realized that, as my team members, we needed to reach out to our customers. We wanted to know what they wanted, what they needed. And this is when we started creating our own content at home. And we reach out to our customers even more through social media, to Instagram. So from here, we started creating cooking tutorials, styling tutorials, and we started giving honest reviews about the outfits that we were wearing. And we saw how people reached out to us, the customers. They wanted to tell us what they felt. They wanted to tell us what they wanted, what they needed. And I feel like this is how we're gonna move forward, I think, by reaching out more to your customers.
Thank you, Shasha. Marty, I pretty much don't need to ask you the question anymore, but because Shasha opened for you splendidly. But talking about social media domination and especially about her angle to getting sales back started with her team, so taking the social media channels directly back into the buyer's hands, at least in Zalora, for a couple of our channels. What would be your advice at this point in time? Your usage is going through the roof. We saw your Q1, and anyways, it's pretty much evident. And what would be your advice to brands in terms of how to create organic content and what type of organic content to focus on to reinitiate sales at this point in time?
Got it. All right. Thank you so much, Julio, for that question. And thank you, Shasha, for opening that up. But before that, just want to say thank you guys to everyone watching us right now. Thank you for spending your time with us. I know it's incredibly hard for everyone, so I hope everyone's staying safe at home and staying healthy. So yeah, so on the first question around the time spent on social media. So definitely we've seen increased engagement across all our apps. And that's precisely because a lot of the people really use it for them to stay informed, to stay connected with people and organizations that they care about. And I think just to highlight some of like the key changes that's been accelerated within the platform, definitely around watching news. So definitely this is something that we've seen when COVID was starting, when lockdown announcement was happening. In fact, when it comes to Facebook, no more than 3 billion people now are actively using it. Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, or Messenger. And then deep diving into another major activity that's really happening is really messaging. So given the desire to stay connected, people really rely on messaging services. So in fact, messaging volume increased more than 50%, and voice and video calling have more than doubled time spent since then. So again, really a lot of spike when it comes to that. And lastly, when it comes to the activity that we've seen really spike in the platform, it's live video. So if you guys have seen it, so every day more than 800 million people are using now live streams, whether you're doing your workout classes or cooking something, suggesting new recipes, or even doing your own concerts where we see celebrities and artists doing that. So now more than ever at Facebook, live video is something that's super important. And we know that this is also what's going to happen in the long term. When it comes to advices for how brands can actually really take advantage of this new changes in consumer behavior, I think it really depends also on the priority. First one, if you're a brand, then first and foremost, you really have to prioritize managing your brand presence. And at this time, it's really difficult if you're doing brand building, if you don't have any rules, you don't know what's happening. But we do learn that there's some mindsets that we have to take in place at this time. So first one around planning. So it's really around innovating for the new reality. So people are adapting to the new normal. So as brands, be empathetic. You know this one, Shasha mentioned it earlier, be mindful and helpful when you're talking to your consumers, when you connect to them, be very sensitive about what's to happen, what's the situation. Second one around branding. So it's really inviting connection, right? So we know consumers right now are rapidly embracing digital connections. So how do you create that online experiences for your community, whether you're doing a live or whether that's on Facebook or Instagram? How do you now encourage dialogue and conversation, such as what we're doing right now? The third bit is around messaging. So how do you inspire through generosity? So we know people are turning their concerns into acts of care. So how do you, as a brand, as an influencer right now, spark positivity, unite and uplift your community? So are there anything about social good, community initiatives that you can be proactive about and be the voice to the community? Is there anything about sharing content that will get your audience talking or put a smile on their faces, as what Shasha also mentioned earlier? And the last piece is around selling. Right now, it's really about impacting your communities. So people are looking for companies for leadership. So as a brand, how do you lead with empathy? How do you be yourself? And how do you always make sure that you add value when you're communicating to your consumers? So those are just some things which can definitely help when it comes to brands and influencers within the platform.
Thank you, Marty. Thank you. The getting back closer to the consumer and getting back into a direct conversation with them aligns with what Shasha told us. And I think the point on video, it seems very clear, both from you, but also from the rise of one of your strong competitors at this moment in time is certainly pointing in the direction of video taking a dominant role in the interaction of social media play. I'd like to circle back, unless any of the panelists wants to jump in with a question to any of the other panelists. So please do interrupt me at any point with that. But I would have circled back now to Jonathan. And Jonathan, I wanted to ask you, if you basically put your strategy hat on, which is, from understanding, one of your responsibilities in PVH, I would imagine that compared to 5 months ago, 6 months ago, as brands, as corporations in general, we are reviewing the allocation of future investments. We're allocating where are we putting our capex, whether it's physical capex, whether it's R&D capex, whether it's IP creation, etc. Whilst I'm sure you can't spill the beans on all of your secrets and plans. Can you walk us through how you're thinking about that process and how you're thinking about positioning yourself and your organization for the future, at least in our.
Sure. So I think if you read through earnings announcements or follow different companies' reactions to things, everybody's basically done a very similar set of things immediately, right? Whether that's having a look at capex and either significantly reducing or scrutinizing that, whether it's around suspending dividends or share buybacks, other sort of corporate level activities. And you're exactly right. I think what's happening for everybody is everybody now is in a position where you don't have the luxury, let's say, of having a lot of certainty if you want to look out 2 years or 3 years. So as folks are thinking about returns on investment in an ordinary circumstance, you may make a different decision because you say, well, this is a key pillar of the strategy and something that you want to build out over the next 2, 3, 5, 10 years, and you see sort of a payback period. I think everybody's just naturally being cautious to say, certainly there are things that are must do or that have to continue or that you would do. It's a no regrets move. You would do it in any circumstance. But I think on things that are nice to have or things that are maybe sort of, not clear if it's going to work, not clear if it's going to be relevant, I think everybody's just being a bit more cautious on those. I do think, obviously with the rotation into e-commerce, it's a natural topic that anybody who is either already working in e-commerce or wants to be in e-commerce and whatnot, I think those types of things everybody is really sort of prioritizing, right? It makes sense given where the consumer is going. It makes sense to have those types of business models. And then every company has to make the right sort of set of choices around what's the right mix and how to think about it, geographically and other things. But I do think there's going to be one set of things that really is coming out of what's the post-COVID or the whatever phase you want to put it in. What does that physical retail shopping experience look like? So are there things consumers will start to demand and expect, whether it's around sanitation, whether it's around cleaning stores, whether it's around not wanting to try on merchandise or wanting to have comfort and certainty from the retailer or the brand that their health and safety is a priority. And equally important is the store associates, right? So for folks who are working in stores and warehouses, what are the precautions that are going in place to make sure that they're working in a safe environment? We've announced recently some steps to put in place, things in the stores, things in warehouses that are really focused on those couple of topics. So I think that's really a very something that's obviously a direct consequence that now everybody is very focused on that as a short-term piece. But then I think as you go forward, people are really thinking about what's the role of a physical retail store going to look like. And obviously, folks have been, experimenting with whether you call it omni-channel, multi-channel, unified commerce, harmonized commerce, whatever it is. What does that look like? And so I think people are really starting to accelerate further into making investments in those areas, into thinking about what's the role of my store? Can it function as a warehouse? Can it function as, an engagement place that I can turn it into somewhere for live streaming or somewhere where I can connect my store associates with an online consumer? So I think that's where, it starts to get really interesting in terms of the technology piece, the platforms piece, the agility pieces. And the good news is, I would say on those things is there are ways to, test and learn. There's ways to, look at software as a service, platform as a service solutions that are either existing or being developed. But I think that's going to be the really critical piece that everybody's going to have a look at. I do think, you mentioned the McKinsey report earlier, there's just naturally going to end up with store closures, across different industries and across different geographies, as well as just various changes that we'll go through. There's going to be brands that don't exist that maybe are not very well capitalized, or we're in a growth phase and just run out of cash. So I think, we feel pretty fortunate to have a strong balance sheet, and it's something our CEO and our board talk about a lot. But I do think you're going to see, what does that flow through into? What does a shopping mall look like if stores, or a third of stores, or a quarter of stores are empty or converted to other things, right? So if they go away from being apparel stores and maybe it's a grocery store, or it's a pharmacy, or it's a sanitation store, or whatever it might be. So I think there's a lot of things that are going to come out. Some are these new trends around sanitation, which is going to be an interesting one. Some are acceleration of trends that were already happening, the e-commerce, the omni-channel, unified commerce, whatnot. And I think the consumer is going to really, dictate how and where they spend those dollars, right? Are they holding spend? Are they shopping for different wearing occasions? Are they shopping more for a comfort piece? So I think, diversification is the only free lunch I think that anybody gets anymore. And so I think as folks start to play that through, those are some of the considerations that are going to be top of mind.
Thank you, Jonathan. I think you touched on something, great topic that was not on the tip of my tongue, but it now is, and it is, what is the reinvention of the offline store, and what is it going to look like? I mean, I was just a couple of days ago on on another webinar. Some people will start thinking that's all I do, but on that webinar we had one of the leaders of Coupang in Korea, and the leader of Coupang in Korea was telling me how already malls and wholesale locations in Korea have completely transformed the stalls into green backdrop studios. So imagine a wholesale mall turning into a basically set of cubicles, and each cubicle is a studio, not just for webcasts, but also simply for Zoom level selling in the case of B2B sales. Stuart, how are you guys thinking about this topic? So the reinvention of the store, is there some level of, are you guys rethinking that, or being in the more basic and function-driven category, and seeing already a return of sales, as you were telling us earlier, you believe you'll be touched less by this, and you'll be able to still operate stores in a much similar way as the pre-COVID year?
I'm not sure they're exactly similar. I think the optimism around stores should be real. Certainly, as I've suggested, we've found that so far. I think the customer, it's really for our business, it comes back to the customer. So we've got to lead, we've got to be optimistic, we've got to, I think Jonathan was right, we have to, first of all, make the environment safe for our team to feel like they're in a safe environment, they're back at work, they're back doing what they love. If they're safe and feeling connected to the business, then they're connected to our customers. So we're certainly concentrating on delivering in whatever channel, whether it be online or in stores or with our partners, marketplace and wholesale partners, what the customer wants. So the focus, as the business has always been, is to, at our value lifestyle part of the business, we totally concentrate on what the customer wants from us. So we're constantly moving and flipping and trying new things across different brands, and we can still a private business, so we can move and adapt to things we learn across different regions and across different businesses all the time. But it's very much business as usual, but there's things that certainly accelerating that we're working on that are certainly at the forefront of all of our seems like daily meetings now.
Thank you, Stuart. Well, guys, I think given the time, we'll jump into directly the Q&A. So I'm going to start picking. We've got quite a lot of questions through our chat and our Q&A box. I'm going to start picking a few and throwing them around between us. We've touched already on a few of the customer questions. At least means we were touching on a few interesting topics, from webinars to the importance of video selling. to occasion wear earlier on. There's an interesting question in terms of premium brands, Jonathan, which maybe I would bring to you. So there's a question that goes around the fact that ultimately the Q2 slump in most of the world, and in China probably Q1, has seen a accumulation of inventory. And that accumulation of inventory is seeing massive sell-offs, at least in some areas of and some regions of the world. What is, from a brand, a set of brands like PVH, where you also have some premium and quite a few premium brands in your portfolio, how are you thinking about that? And how are you approaching the, let's say, pricing standpoint versus balance sheet and cash flow standpoint of managing trade post-COVID on during COVID?
Sure. So, I mean, I think everybody is really thinking about two phases, right? So the first one is, what do you do with the inventory that you already have or that you have coming in, or receipts and whatnot? And so you definitely have to find a solution for that. So I think, some of the things that I think everybody looks at are, how do you reflow some of those inventories? How do you either look at different markets or different channels and start to think about having a healthy inventory position across the board? But the longer term piece is, I think, where it gets really interesting, right? So the historical fashion calendar has been built around kind of two big seasons and maybe two shoulder seasons. And there's been a lot of evolution over the years in terms of what that looks like. But I think everybody is really going to have to go back and have a look to understand, what does that mean, depending on where you play, whether you're a retailer, a brand principal, you're a vendor or a factory base, a supplier and whatnot, or a platform or whatever you might be. And then how do you think about different types of inventory models, right? Whether that's more core types of product, whether that's product that has a longer selling period, whether it's more smaller capsules, whether it's more lighter and flexible and quicker response types of supply chain. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you move fully into kind of a fast fashion type of mode and you're doing that. But I do think there's a lot of different levers that you can pull, especially depending on category lead times and distribution and whatnot. And I think one of the things that we're going to see potentially as well is everybody start to really look through the supply chain to understand where they have strengths today, where they want to make adjustments and changes. In an ordinary circumstance, if you are, sourcing product from a country or a market that's 6,000 or 8,000 miles away, and it's going to, sit on a boat for a number of weeks, and then by the time it gets into your store, it could be 2 or 3 months later. I think there may be choices that people want to make that then reduce their overall kind of inventory levels or allow them to react more quickly. I think the unpredictability piece is really the only thing that's going to be certain for the next kind of 12 to 18 months as everything plays out. And I think everybody is naturally trying to figure out a short-term solution, but then also really trying to think as early as now, what does that look like moving forward?
Thank you, Jonathan. Probably something that we should have anyways focused on pre-COVID, supply chain optimization and rationalization. Maybe that brings me to a question which is very much tied to the supply chain side, but maybe taking a demand angle to it, a question from the audience. And Jerome, I'd throw this one at you, but please, anybody I think can chip into this one. And it is, what are you seeing with regards to sustainability, sustainable fashion, and the impact, the ecological and human impact and world impact of fashion versus probably previous trends in fast fashion and fast fashion demand?
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess I wouldn't have the deep industry expertise to be able to cut between the two. But I think one kind of overriding trend that will impact how this will play out is we're certainly seeing a very price conscious consumer. Coming post-COVID, worries about recession. We've seen, online coupons and things like that, searches for those, skyrocket in most markets as they ease out of lockdown. So how that will then impact, how people want to purchase more, perhaps more expensive or more premium items. I think will be interesting, and I think it puts up a lot of questions about how we should be thinking about moving product, but also making sure that we're appealing to consumers that are going to be very savvy. But when it comes to the fast fashion sustainability piece, I mean, I'll throw it out to the rest of the group to see if there's any comments on that one.
Thank you, Jerome. And maybe from somebody who retails it and has it on the shelves or on the online shelves at this moment in time, depending on the country. Stuart, I know the Coronel Group has made enormous investments and efforts towards the sustainability of some of your lines and reducing the ecological impact. Are you seeing a renewed or enhanced consciousness? I mean, I think we were seeing this trend, of course, like a lot of others pre-COVID. But has there been an acceleration? Has it followed maybe the curve of e-commerce itself in terms of accelerating a pre-existing trend?
I'm not sure whether it's at certain categories that were trending anyway, but certainly in our body business, all of our initiatives around BCI cotton initiatives, certainly recycled yarns, recycled nylons through swimwear for the Northern Hemisphere, and we've had an amazing run with recycled puffer vests that are all 100% recyclable. So that, from a search term, certainly for our business has been, our customers have been demanding it, and we're growing that part of our business as fast as we can get supply of it. So the customer sometimes does not understand that, the intentions are certainly there, but the ability to get raw materials and to be able to, for supply chains to be built to be able to service a global business like ours are difficult. You also have to ensure that our ethical trade, so those processes and onboarding of those factories takes a little bit of time. So we've certainly found that anything that we've been able to get through our supply chain in recycled yarns or the BCI cotton has been really well received by our customers. And I think above what COVID has done and above what our price point has done at this time, the customer is still searching, and that's resonating with them.
Look, it's great to hear about the renewed consciousness. There's a lot of optimism around how much our impact upon the world will diminish or go towards the better post-COVID. Guys, with that, I think we're just on time, and I would like to thank you all for joining and for sharing your expertise. Also thank all of our audience for participating, asking questions, and listening to us. Sorry if we weren't able to answer all of them. We might get back to some of you, and you have Zalora's contacts anyhow to blast us with them. Guys, thanks a lot, and have a good weekend ahead, and a good Raya weekend for all the Muslims in the audience and amongst the panelists. Thank you, guys. Have a good weekend.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.